There are things about a piece of land that the people who never worked it will never understand. They see dirt. They see broken glass. They see a building that should have been torn down years ago. They do not see the hands that built it, the mornings that watered it, the nights that watched over when the frost came down hard and the heat had to be kept alive by candle stubs and prayer. They did not see the names whispered into the soil when nobody else was listening. My name is Caleb Hartwell, and on my 18th birthday, my stepmother handed me a key, a folded piece of paper, and told me to get out of her house before sundown. The key was old, brass, tarnished green at the teeth, with a strip of masking tape wrapped around the bow where my grandfather had once written a single word in pencil so faint I could barely read it. Eden. The folded paper was a deed. A property deed for 3.5 acres on the edge of Marrow County, Tennessee, with a 40-year-old greenhouse standing on it that hadn't grown anything but weeds since my grandfather died 8 years ago. That's all he left you, Brenda said, standing in the kitchen with her arms folded, the morning light catching on the gold cross around her neck. A glass shed and a patch of mud. The lawyer says it's yours legally now that you're of age. Frankly, I'd burn it down before I'd pay another year of taxes on it, but that's your problem now. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at the calendar on the refrigerator. She looked at the chip in the countertop where my father had once dropped a coffee mug the morning he found out about the cancer. She looked at every single thing in that kitchen, except the boy she had spent the last 8 years pretending to raise. If you've ever been told you were a burden by someone who was supposed to love you, if you've ever been handed something that the world called worthless and felt the weight of it anyway, I need you to stay with me through this whole story. Because what I found inside that greenhouse, sealed behind a wall my grandfather built with his own hands a year before he died, is the kind of thing that rewrites a life. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me when the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I packed everything I owned into a duffel bag and a cardboard box. It didn't take long. Brenda had been throwing my father's things away for years. Slowly, the way a person empties a drawer when they think no one is watching, and she had started on mine the week I turned 17. My books were gone. My father's old work boots were gone. The pocket watch my grandfather had given me on my 10th birthday had vanished from my dresser one Sunday afternoon, while I was at the diner washing dishes for $7.25 an hour. What I had left fit in 2 hands. A change of clothes. A pair of work gloves. A photograph of my mother holding me when I was 2 years old, taken in front of the greenhouse in Marrow County, her hand resting on the white-painted doorframe, her face turned towards something off-camera that was making her smile. My grandfather's old field journal, leather-bound, the spine cracked in 3 places, full of handwritten notes about soil pH and humidity cycles and the specific behavior of plants I couldn't pronounce. And the key, Eden, the bus to Marrow County, left at 4:40 in the afternoon. Brenda drove me to the station in silence. When I got out of the car, she didn't get out with me. She didn't hug me. She didn't say goodbye. She rolled the window down halfway and said, "Don't call here, Caleb. There's nothing here for you anymore." Then she drove away. I stood on the curb of that bus station for a long time before I went inside. The October air had that cold edge to it. That means winter is coming whether you're ready or not. And I wasn't ready. I had $93 in my wallet, 3 changes of clothes, and a piece of paper that said I own a building nobody had stepped inside in 8 years. The bus ride was 4 hours. I sat by the window and watched the suburbs of Nashville give way to the long, rolling country that meant we were heading east into the foothills. I knew the road. My father had driven me down it 100 times when I was small, before my mother got sick, before everything began to come apart. He used to call it the going home road. Even though we never lived in Marrow County, we just visited. We visited my grandfather, Elias Hartwell, who lived alone on those 3.5 acres in a small white farmhouse with a greenhouse out back that he had built with his own 2 hands in 1978. My grandfather was not a wealthy man. That's what everybody said. He had been a high school agriculture teacher for 31 years before he retired, and after that he just grew things. That's how he described his work to me when I was a child. I just grow things, Caleb. The Lord made the dirt, and he made the seed, and he told us to put them together. That's all I do. But there was more to it than that. There was always more to it than that. When I was 9 years old, my grandfather took me into the greenhouse on a hot July afternoon, sat me down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket, and told me there was something inside that building that nobody else knew about. Something he had been working on for almost 20 years. Something he was going to leave to the right person when the time came. I asked him what it was. He looked at me for a long moment, the way a man looks at a horse he's deciding whether to buy. Then he said, "When you're old enough, Caleb, when the world has tried to break you, and you're still standing, that's when I'll tell you, not before." He died 11 months later. A stroke, the doctor said. Quick. He was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the morning paper, and then he wasn't anymore. The greenhouse was locked the day they found him. The key was in his pocket. My father took it home, put it in a drawer, and we never spoke of property again. My father died of pancreatic cancer when I was 13. Brenda, his second wife, who had married 3 years after my mother passed, inherited the house in Nashville, his life insurance, his savings, his pickup truck, and his son. She kept the first 4. The 5th she tolerated, until the day I turned 18, and tolerating me was no longer required by law. The bus dropped me off at a gas station in the town of Linwood, which is the closest thing Marrow County has to a town. Population 1,847, according to the sign by the post office. I walked the last 2 miles of property with my duffel bag over one shoulder and my cardboard box under the other arm, and the road was empty, and the sun was already going down behind a ridge, and I was so tired by the time I saw the gate that I almost laughed out loud, because the world had finally given me exactly the version of itself I had been expecting all along. The gate was rusted shut. The driveway was a strip of broken gravel half swallowed by Johnson grass. The farmhouse was still standing, but the porch had collapsed on one side, and the front windows were boarded up with plywood that had gone gray in the weather. And behind the house, set back about 40 yards in a clearing of dead orchard grass, was the greenhouse. It was bigger than I remembered, almost 60 feet long, 20 feet wide, with a peaked roof of glass panels, most of them cracked, a few of them missing entirely, all of them so caked with grime that the building looked more like a tomb than a place where things had once grown. The white-painted door frame from a photograph of my mother was still there, but the paint was peeling off in long curls, and the door itself was hanging by one hinge. I stood at the edge of that clearing for a long time. The sun went down. The crickets started up. Somewhere off in the woods, a barred owl called once and then went quiet. Worthless. That's what Brenda had called it. A glass shed and a patch of mud. I walked up to the greenhouse, fitted the brass key into the padlock that held the half-broken door shut, and turned it. The lock opened on the first try. 8 years it had been hanging there, and it opened like my grandfather had oiled it the day before he died. Inside, the air was cool and dry and smelled like dust and old wood. The benches were still standing, long wooden benches running the length of the building on both sides, but they were empty. The pots were stacked in towers along the back wall, all of them empty too. The irrigation system, a network of black tubing my grandfather had rigged himself, was coiled up and tied off in neat loops. Everything had been put away. Whoever had locked this building 8 years ago had taken the time to put everything away first. I set my box and my duffel down on the concrete floor. I walked the length of the building slowly, my footsteps echoing off the glass roof. At the far end, against the back wall, was my grandfather's potting bench, the one I remember from when I was a child, the one with the deep wooden drawers and the metal scoop hanging from a nail. I pulled open the top drawer. Empty. I pulled open the second drawer. Empty. I pulled open the third drawer, the deep one at the bottom, and inside it, sitting on a folded piece of canvas tarp, was a sealed manila envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's handwriting. For Caleb, to be opened on his 18th birthday, in the greenhouse, alone. My hand was shaking when I picked it up. I sat down on the concrete floor with my back against the potting bench, and I broke the seal, and I pulled out what was inside. There was a letter, 6 pages, single-spaced, in my grandfather's careful, deliberate handwriting. There was a folded survey map of the property. There was a smaller envelope, sealed with red wax, that had the words "Do not open until you have read the letter" written across the front in capital letters. And there was a second key, smaller than the first, brass, like the one I'd use on a padlock, but with a different kind of head, squared off, with a number stamped into it. Bay 3. I looked up at the greenhouse around me. There were no bays. It was one long open room, 3 long benches on each side, a center aisle, a back wall. Or so I had thought. I started reading the letter. Caleb, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and your father is gone, and the world has done to you what I was afraid it would do. I am sorry, son. I am sorry I did not live long enough to see you become a man. I am sorry I could not protect you from the people who were supposed to love you and didn't. I want you to know 3 things before you read another word. First, this property is yours, free and clear. The deed has been in trust in your name since the day you were born. Your father knew about it. Brenda did not. The taxes are paid through 2031. I prepaid them 10 years at a time, the year I turned 70, because I knew what kind of woman your father had married, and I knew what she would try to do. Second, there is a back room in this greenhouse. You have not seen it. No one has seen it for almost 20 years except me. The wall behind the potting bench you are sitting against right now is false. I built it in 1992. There's a door behind the 3rd stack of pots from the left. The small key opens the lock. Third, what is inside that room is the work of my entire life. It is also the reason this property is not worth the $8,000 Brenda probably told you it was worth. It is worth, by the most conservative estimate I have been able to obtain, something in the neighborhood of $2.5 million. I stopped reading. I read that last sentence again. I read it a 3rd time. Then I sat in that greenhouse, 18 years old, with $93 in my pocket and no place to sleep that night, and I cried for the first time since my father's funeral. I cried for a long time, not because of the money. The money didn't feel real yet. I cried because somebody had loved me. Somebody had thought about me, planned for me, protected me when I was a child too small to know it was happening, and that somebody had been gone for 8 years, and I had spent every one of those 8 years believing I was alone. When I could see again, I picked the letter back up, and I kept reading. My grandfather had been a botanist before he was a teacher, not just a hobbyist, a real one, with a master's degree from the University of Tennessee and a specialty in cultivated orchids. He had worked for a private nursery in Knoxville for 6 years in the early 1970s before he came home to Marrow County to take care of his own dying father. He never went back to commercial work, but he never stopped doing it either. He just did it quietly in his own greenhouse, on his own land, with his own seed stock. For 31 years, from 1979 until his stroke in 2017, my grandfather had been quietly cultivating, hybridizing, and stabilizing a line of slipper orchids that did not exist anywhere else in the world. Specifically, a strain of Paphiopedilum, what the trade calls lady slippers, that had crossed and back-crossed and selected for so long that it created entirely new cultivars. 3 of them by his count. One of them, the one he called Eden's Vale, after my mother's name, had taken him 19 years to stabilize. Collectors had been writing him letters about his plants since the late 1990s. He had ignored most of them. The ones he answered, he sold to in single specimens for cash at prices he set himself. There was a binder he wrote in the back room. The binder had every letter, every offer, every name. The most recent offer in the binder, dated 3 months before his death, was from a private collector in Singapore who had offered him $180,000 for a single division of Eden's Vale. He had turned it down. He had turned all of them down because he was waiting for me. The seed bank in the back room contains 11 distinct cultivars, he wrote. 6 of them are mine. 5 of them are wild lines I rescued from collectors who did not know what they had. Every one of them is alive. Caleb, I built the room to keep them alive without me. The cooling system runs off a propane tank buried 50 feet from the back wall. The tank holds enough fuel to last 12 years on the lowest setting, and I last refilled it the spring before I died. You have time. Not much, but enough. I sat there on the concrete floor of that greenhouse with a letter in my lap and the wax-sealed envelope still unopened beside me, and I thought about Brenda. I thought about her standing in the kitchen that morning, telling me the property was a glass shed and a patch of mud. I thought about the way she had said, worthless like the word tasted good in her mouth. She didn't know. She didn't know any of it. My father had known. My grandfather had told me later in the letter. But my father had kept the secret because my grandfather had asked him to. My father had died believing that someday I would walk into that greenhouse on my 18th birthday and find what was waiting for me. And he had never told Brenda a word about it because he knew exactly what kind of woman she was. He had let her think she was getting everything. He had let her think worthless was the truth, because the only thing he had to leave me that she could not steal was the thing she did not know existed. I got up off the concrete floor. I walked over to the third stack of empty pots from the left. I moved the pots aside, one tower at a time, until I could see the wall behind them. It looked like a normal greenhouse wall, white painted plywood, weathered at the seams, dusty along the bottom edge. But when I ran my hand along the surface, I felt the seam, a perfect rectangular outline, almost invisible against the rest of the wall, just to the right of where the bench ended, 3 feet wide, 6 feet tall. The door my grandfather had built. I found the lock. It was set into the wood at hip height, recessed so deeply you would have had to know it was there to find it. The small brass key fit. I turned it. The lock opened with a soft, well-oiled click. I pulled the door open. The room behind the wall was not large, maybe 10 feet by 12. The walls were lined with insulation panels. The air inside was cool, not cold, but noticeably cooler than the rest of the greenhouse, and a soft mechanical hum was coming from somewhere behind the back wall. The cooling system, still running. 8 years after my grandfather's death, still running. There were 3 rows of metal racks along the walls. Each rack held trays. Each tray held plants. Slipper orchids. Dozens of them. Maybe 100. Some of them blooming. Even in October. Pale gold ones with brown veining. Deep maroon ones with white throats. 1 row of them. The row at eye level, in the center of the back wall, were a color I had never seen on a flower before. A green so dark it was almost black, with a pale silver sheen along the edges of the petals, like moonlight on still water. Eden's veil. I stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. I did not go inside. I was afraid to breathe too hard. I was afraid that if I stepped in, the spell would break, and I would wake up on the bus to Marrow County and find that none of it had ever been real. But it was real. The soft hum of the cooling system was real. The cool air on my face was real. The flowers were real, and they were mine, and my grandfather had spent the last 20 years of his life keeping them alive for a boy he would not live to see become a man. I closed the door. I locked it. I walked back to the potting bench, sat down on the concrete floor, and finally opened the wax-sealed envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a name, an address, and a phone number. Marion Webb, attorney at law, 412 Court Street, Linwood, Tennessee. And beneath it, in my grandfather's hand, call her in the morning. She is expecting you. She has been expecting you for 8 years. That night, I slept on the concrete floor of the greenhouse, wrapped in my coat, with the duffel bag for a pillow. I did not sleep well. But for the first time in years, when I closed my eyes, I was not alone in the dark. My grandfather was there. My father was there. They had been there the whole time, and I had just not been able to see them. In the morning, I walked to town. Marion Webb's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building above a hardware store. She was 62 years old, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, with a voice like a schoolteacher who had heard every excuse a child could invent. When I walked in and told her my name, she stood up from behind her desk, came around it, and looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "You've got your grandfather's eyes." She poured me a cup of coffee. She sat me down in a leather chair across from her desk, and she told me what my grandfather had set up 8 years before in a will that Brenda had never seen and never been informed of because my grandfather had not trusted her and had specifically excluded her from notification. The deed to the property was held in a revocable trust that named me as sole beneficiary upon my 18th birthday. The trust had been funded with $12,000 at the time of my grandfather's death, enough to cover property taxes, basic maintenance, and the propane refills on the cooling system, which Marion Webb herself had personally arranged every spring for the past 8 years. "Your grandfather paid me a retainer," she said. I have been earning it. The plants in the back room were also held in trust, separately, as personal property. There was a documented inventory. There were photographs. There were registration papers for 3 of the cultivars filed with the American Orchid Society under my grandfather's name. There was a binder of correspondence with collectors going back 26 years. And there was a letter from my grandfather to Marion Webb, dated April of 2017, 2 weeks before he died, instructing her do exactly what she was doing now, to wait for me, to tell me nothing until I came to her on my own, and to make sure that when I did come, I came knowing. He didn't want you to be rescued, Caleb, she said. He wanted you to arrive. He wanted you to walk into that greenhouse on your own 2 feet and find what was waiting for you. He thought it would mean more that way. I sat in that chair for a long time. I did not know what to say. Eventually, Marion Webb leaned forward across her desk and asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I needed a day to think. I walked back to the greenhouse. I sat on the concrete floor. I read my grandfather's letter again, all 6 pages, slowly, taking my time. And somewhere in the middle of the 3rd reading, I started to understand what he had really left me. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It wasn't the money. The money was real and the money mattered, but the money wasn't the inheritance. The inheritance was the work. 31 years of careful, patient, invisible labor. A man who had lost his wife young, who had outlived his only son, who had watched his daughter-in-law strip his grandchild down to the bone, and who had answered all of it not with anger but with cultivation. He had spent the last third of his life growing something beautiful in a locked room behind a false wall, because he had decided that the world was going to take a great deal from his grandson, and he was going to make sure the world did not get to take everything. He had not raised me. He hadn't been able to. He died when I was 10 years old. But he had grown me, the same way he had grown his orchids, patiently, in secret, across years. And the greenhouse, the worthless glass shed, the patch of mud, the building Brenda would have burned down for the insurance, was the room where he had done the growing. I called Marion Webb the next morning. I told her I wanted to keep the property. I told her I did not want to sell the plants, not all of them, not yet. I told her I wanted to learn how to take care of them. She told me she had been hoping I would say that. The next 4 months were the hardest months of my life. I moved into the farmhouse, into the one room that still had a roof that didn't leak, and I started repairing the property by hand, 1 board at a time, with money I drew in small amount from the trust, supervised by Marion, who had been authorized to release funds to me for property maintenance and basic living expenses. I bought tools. I bought lumber. I bought books on orchid cultivation, and I read them at night by the light of a single bulb, because for the first 3 weeks, the farmhouse did not have heat. I learned the cooling system. I learned the irrigation. I learned how to mix the bark and perlite and sphagnum moss that Paphiopedilum require, how to read the leaves for stress, how to space the watering, how to manage the humidity. I called the names on the list of collectors my grandfather had left me, one by one, and I introduced myself. I'm Caleb Hartwell. I'm Elias Hartwell's grandson. I have his plants. Some of them did not believe me. Some of them did. The ones who did began to come to Marrow County. They came from Atlanta. They came from Charleston. One of them came from London. They walked into that greenhouse, and they walked into the back room, and they stood in front of the racks of Eden's Vale, and most of them cried. I sold 3 plants in the first 6 months. 3 single divisions, to 3 buyers I trusted, for a combined total of $214,000. I used the money to repair the farmhouse, to refill the propane tank, to install a new humidity-controlled climate system in the back room, and to put aside almost half of it in an account Marion set up for me at the bank in Linwood. In December, 8 weeks after I had moved into the property, I called Brenda. I called her from the kitchen of the farmhouse, sitting at the same wooden table my grandfather had been sitting at when he died. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was sharp and impatient, the way it had always been. Caleb, what do you want? I told you not to call here. I'm not asking to come back. I said, then why are you calling? I took a breath. I had thought about what I wanted to say for a long time. I had practiced it in my head every night for 2 months. I had thought I would feel angry when the moment came. I had thought I would want to hurt her. But standing in that kitchen, with the heat finally working and the smell of coffee in the air and the greenhouse glowing softly through the kitchen window, what I felt instead was something quieter, something almost sad. I wanted you to know that the property wasn't worthless, I said. I wanted you to know that he left me something, that he thought about me, that somebody did. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" she said. Her voice had changed. The sharpness was still there, but underneath it, something else was creeping in, something careful. "He left me the greenhouse. He left me what was in it. I'm not going to tell you what was in it, because you didn't ask, and you don't get to ask now. But I wanted you to know that you were wrong. About him, about me, about what was worthless. You were wrong about all of it." The silence on the other end stretched out for so long, I thought she had hung up. Then she said very quietly, "How much, Caleb?" And there it was, the whole woman, in 3 words. "Goodbye, Brenda," I said. I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I got up, put on my coat, walked out to the greenhouse, and went to work. She tried to call back. Twice that night, for times the next day, 11 times over the course of the following week. I did not answer. Eventually, she sent a letter through a lawyer, a Nashville lawyer, expensive, the kind who writes letters on heavy cream-colored paper, claiming that as my father's widow, she had a legal interest in any inheritance of my grandfather that had passed through my father's estate. Marion Webb wrote back. The letter she sent was 4 sentences long. It explained that the property and its contents had never passed through my father's estate because the trust had been established in 1999, 18 years before my father's death, and that any further communication on the matter would be considered harassment and treated accordingly. We never heard from Brenda's lawyer again. We never heard from Brenda again either. Not a Christmas card, not a phone call, not a single word. I do not know where she is now. I do not particularly want to know. The greenhouse is still standing. It looks different now. The glass panels are clean. The white paint on the doorframe is fresh. The orchard grass has been mowed back. The farmhouse has a new porch, a new roof, and a wood stove that keeps the kitchen warm all winter long. There's a sign at the gate now, hand-painted, that reads Hartwell Botanicals in green letters on a white background. Below it, in smaller letters, it reads established 1979. I am 24 years old now. I have been running this place for 6 years. I have not sold Eden's Vale, not a single division of it, to anyone. I have offers every month. I turn them all down. My grandfather waited 19 years to stabilize that cultivar, and I am not going to scatter it across the world for cash. Some of it, eventually, I will share. The rest of it I will keep, and I will grow, and I will carry forward. The way he carried it forward, in a back room behind a false wall in a glass building on 3.5 acres in Marrow County, Tennessee. I run a small commercial nursery from the front half of the greenhouse now. I sell common orchids and tropical houseplants to people who drive in from Linwood and Knoxville and Asheville. I employ 2 people part-time, both of them kids who grew up in foster care, the way I almost did, the way I would have if my grandfather had not been who he was. I pay them a fair wage. I teach them what I know. One of them, a girl named Anna who is 16 years old and has not lived in the same house for more than 9 months in her entire life, has a real gift for it. She can read a plant the way some people read a book. I am going to leave this place to her one day, if she wants it, the same way it was left to me. The back room is still there. The cooling system still hums. The plants still bloom. Sometimes, in the evening, after I close up the front of the greenhouse and lock the gate at the road, I unlock the door behind the 3rd stack of pots from the left, and I go in there alone. I stand in front of the rack of Eden's Vale, and I look at the flowers. The dark green ones, almost black, with the silver edges that catch the light like moonlight on still water, and I think about my grandfather and my mother and my father and the 8 years I spent thinking I was alone. I was never alone. I just couldn't see who was with me yet. That's the thing about land, and about the people who work it, and about the things they leave behind for people who come after them. The world will tell you it is worthless. The world will tell you it is mud and broken glass, and a building that should be torn down. The world will tell you that what your family left you is nothing, because the world does not know how to see what cannot be sold quickly. But the soil remembers. The seed remembers. The hands of the man who built the wall remember. And one day, if you are very lucky and someone loved you enough to plan for you before you were old enough to know they were planning, you will walk through a door you did not know was there, and you'll find what was waiting for you. And you'll understand, finally, that you were never as alone as the world wanted you to believe. My grandfather's name was Elias Hartwell. He was a high school agriculture teacher for 31 years, and a botanist for 50, and a grandfather for 10. And he died at a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee in his hand, and the rest of his work waiting for me in a locked room behind a false wall. I am still doing the work. I will be doing it for a long time, but the story does not end there. I want to tell you the rest of it, because the rest of it is the part that mattered most. The part nobody who hears about an inheritance ever stops to ask about. What happens after? What do you do with a thing like that when the dust settles and the lawyers stop calling and the world goes back to being ordinary? How do you live a life that was almost stolen from you in a place that was almost taken away, with the ghost of a man whose face you can barely remember standing at your shoulder every morning when you walk out into the cold? I am going to tell you about the second winter. The second winter is when I almost lost it all. The first winter, I was running on something close to adrenaline. There was so much to fix, so much to learn, so many people to call, that I did not have time to sit still. I worked 16-hour days. I slept 5 hours a night. I ate cold sandwiches over the kitchen sink, because cooking a real meal felt like a luxury I had not earned. The grief of those 8 years with Brenda, the grief I had pushed down so deep I had stopped feeling it, did not have time to come up. I had a greenhouse to repair. I had a roof to patch. I had 362 living plants to keep alive, and every one of them was older than I was. But the second winter, things were different. The roof was patched. The propane tank was full. The bank account in Linwood had $97,000 in it after I paid for the new climate control system and the porch repairs and the truck I had bought used from a farmer outside of Cookville. The first 3 sales had gone through. The collectors who had come to see the back room had gone home and told other collectors, and the phone rang 2 or 3 times a week now, and Marion Webb had started screening calls for me because she said I needed to learn how to say no without explaining myself. And I had not learned yet. I had time the second winter. I had time, and the work was not as desperate. And one morning in early December, I woke up at 4:30 in the morning in the bedroom that had been my grandfather's bedroom, and I could not remember what my father's voice sounded like. I lay there in the dark for a long time. I tried to bring it back. I tried to remember a specific thing he had said to me. Anything, a single sentence. The way he used to call me Bud when I was small, the way he laughed, the way he sang along to the radio when he didn't think I was listening. I could remember that he had done all of those things. I could remember the fact of him, but I could not remember the sound. The actual sound of him. The voice was gone. I sat up in bed. I turned on the light. I went down to the kitchen and made coffee that I did not drink. And then I walked out to the greenhouse in my coat and my work boots with the laces untied, and I stood in the center aisle in the dark for a long time, listening to the sough of the cooling system through the wall. That was the morning I started keeping the journals. My grandfather had kept journals all his life. I had found them in a wooden crate in the attic of the farmhouse the September before, and I had not been ready to read them yet. There were 42 of them, one for every year from 1976 to 2017. Hardbound notebooks, mostly black, a few green, the dates written in white paint pen on the spines. I had carried the crate down from the attic and set on the floor of the small room off the kitchen, the room my grandfather had used as an office, and I had left it there untouched because every time I looked at it I felt something in my chest tighten up so hard I could not breathe. The morning I forgot my father's voice, I went into that office and I sat down on the floor and I opened the journal labeled 1995. I read for 6 hours. I did not stop for breakfast. I did not stop for lunch. I read until the December light was going gray in the window, and my back was stiff from sitting on the floorboards. And when I finally closed the journal and stood up, my legs had gone numb, and there was a draft of cold air coming under the door of the office, and I was crying again. My grandfather had written about my mother. He had written about her constantly. There were pages and pages about her childhood, about the first time he had taken her into the greenhouse when she was 4 years old, and she had named all the plants by what color they reminded her of, about the night she had told him she was getting married to my father, about the morning he had held me for the first time in a hospital in Nashville and decided that he was going to stabilize the green orchid he had been working on for 6 years and name it after her. He had written about my father, too. He had written about the fishing trip the three of us had taken to Norris Lake the summer I was 7. I did not remember the fishing trip clearly. I remembered that we had gone, and I remembered that my father had caught a bass and let me hold it before he threw it back. But my grandfather had written about it for 4 full pages. He had written about the way my father had laughed when I dropped a worm on my own foot. He had written about the way my father had carried me back to the truck on his shoulders when I fell asleep in the boat. He had written about the way my father had said, on the drive home, that he wished my mother could have seen me catch my first fish. He still talks about her every day. My grandfather had written, he thinks no one notices. But I notice. He carries her with him. He always will. And there on the next page was a single line, written in a different ink, as if my grandfather had come back to that page later and added something. Caleb laughs the way she laughed. He doesn't know it, but he does. I read that sentence 3 times. I closed the journal. I sat on the floor of that office in the gray December light, and I understood for the first time that I was not the end of something. I was the middle of something. There had been people before me who had loved each other, and who had loved me, and who had passed something down to me that was not made of money or land or buildings. It was made of the way they had paid attention to each other. It was made of the small, particular, otherwise unrecorded facts of how they had lived. My grandfather had written it down, all 42 years of it. He had written it down because he knew, at some point during his life, that he was going to die before he could tell me any of it in person. So he had put it on paper, and he had put the paper in a crate in the attic, and he had trusted that one day I would be ready to find it. That was the inheritance. The plants were the gift. The journals were the inheritance. I started reading them in order. After that, 1 a week, sometimes 2. I would read in the evenings, after I closed the gate, with the wood stove going in the kitchen, and a cup of coffee on the table beside me. I learned things about my grandfather that I had not known when he was alive. I learned that he had wanted to be a poet when he was young. I learned that he had served 2 years in the army in Germany in the early 60s, and that he had hated every day of it. I learned that my grandmother, who had died of leukemia when my mother was 11, had been the one who first taught him about orchids. She had grown up in a house in Memphis where her father, a railroad clerk, had kept a small collection of cattleya on the back porch, and she had brought 3 of them with her when she married my grandfather and moved to Marrow County. He had never written much about her. She had died young, and the grief was old by the time he started keeping journals. But every time he mentioned her, his handwriting changed. The letters got smaller. The lines got closer together, as if he were trying to fit her back into a space that was always going to be too small. I started keeping my own journal that winter, a black hardbound notebook, the same kind he had used. I wrote in it every night before I went to bed. I wrote about the plants. I wrote about the work. I wrote about the people who came to the gate, and the calls Mary and Webb had screened that day. I wrote about the things I remembered about my father, in case I forgot them again. I wrote about my mother, the few things I remembered, and the things my grandfather had written down, so I would not have to remember them alone. The second winter is also when I met Hannah Boyd. She came to the gate on a Saturday morning in February. I was out by the road, fixing a section of fence that the cattle from the property next door kept knocking down, and I heard a car pull up behind me, and I turned around, and there was a small green Subaru with a hatchback full of cardboard boxes, and a young woman climbing out of the driver's side with a clipboard in her hand. She was about my age, 20, maybe 21. Dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, a heavy gray coat that was too big for her, the sleeves rolled up at the cuffs. She walked up to me with the clipboard held against her chest, and she said, "I'm looking for Caleb Hartwell." I was told this was the right address. You found him. My name is Hannah Boyd. I'm a graduate student at the University of Tennessee. I'm working on a master's thesis on cultivated Paphiopedilum hybrids in the southeastern United States, and your grandfather's name keeps coming up. I was wondering if I could ask you some questions. I looked at her for a long moment. I had been getting calls from researchers for almost a year by then, botanists, horticulturists, students, a few journalists. Marion had taught me how to handle most of them. I was supposed to be polite and noncommittal. I was supposed to take their information and tell them someone would be in touch. I was supposed to let Marion decide which ones were worth a follow-up. But Hannah Boyd had not called. She had driven 3.5 hours from Knoxville on a February Saturday in a car that had a rust spot the size of a dinner plate on the rear quarter panel, and she had walked up to a stranger who was fixing a fence in the cold and asked him a question without flinching, and there was something in her face, something tired and steady and a little hopeful, that made me set down my fence pliers. "Have you eaten breakfast?" I said. She blinked. "What?" "There's a diner in town. Linwood Cafe, down by the post office. Best biscuits in the county. You probably drove past it on the way out here. If you want to ask me questions, you can buy me breakfast and ask them there. If you don't want to buy me breakfast, you can come into the kitchen and I'll make you eggs. But I'm warning you, I'm not a good cook." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes out before a person has time to decide whether they want to laugh. "Eggs will be fine," she said. We sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours. I made eggs and toast and bad coffee. She showed me her research. She had been studying my grandfather for almost 2 years without knowing he was dead. She had found his name in the registration records at the American Orchid Society, and she had tracked him through old issues of regional horticulture journals, and she had written him 3 letters over the past year to the farmhouse address, which was the address on file with the AOS, and none of them had been answered because none of them had been opened, because they had been piling up in a metal mailbox at the end of the driveway that I had stopped checking after the first month. I went out to the mailbox while she was still sitting at the table. I came back with a stack of 46 envelopes. Her 3 letters were in the stack. So were letters from collectors in 6 different countries, 2 universities, an orchid society in Japan, and a man in California who had been trying to buy a division of Edensvale every 6 months since 2018. I sat back down at the table. I set the stack of letters between us. "I don't know what I'm doing," I said. She looked at the letters. She looked at me. She said, very seriously, "Nobody knows what they're doing. You're just doing it more publicly than most people." I do not know how to explain what happened next, except to say that some people walk into a room and the room rearranges itself around them. Hannah did not move into the farmhouse that day. She drove back to Knoxville that evening, and she went back to her apartment and her thesis, and we did not see each other again for almost 3 weeks. But something started that morning at the kitchen table that had not been there before. I started checking the mailbox again. I started answering the phone when Marion forwarded calls to me. I started, slowly, to come out of the small, quiet world I had built for myself. The world where it was just me and the plants and the journals and the cold December mornings. And I started to remember that there were other people in the world and that some of them were kind. Hannah came back the second weekend in March. She brought a notebook full of questions she had not gotten to ask the first time. She also brought a bag of groceries, because she said my refrigerator had been a crime scene the last time she had seen it. She made stew. We ate at the kitchen table while a thunderstorm came through and the lights flickered twice, and the wind shook the loose pane in the back window of the farmhouse, the one I had not gotten around to fixing yet. When she left that night, I walked her out to the Subaru. The rain had stopped. The driveway smelled like wet gravel and pine. She stood by the open door of the car with her keys in her hand, and she looked up at the greenhouse. Lit from inside, the warm yellow glow of the work lights spilling out to the clean glass panels. And she said, "He really did build something here, didn't he?" "Yeah," I said. "He did. And you're keeping alive." "Trying to." She turned and looked at me. The porch light was behind her, and her face was half in shadow, and I could not read her expression. "He'd be proud of you," she said. "You don't know that." "I've read his journals," she said. "The ones he sent excerpts from to the AOS for his registration applications. I've read them all. I know how he wrote. I know what he cared about. He'd be proud of you, Caleb." I'm sure of it. She got in the car. She drove away. I stood at the end of the driveway until I could not see her taillights anymore. Hannah and I were married 3 years later, in the front yard of the farmhouse, on a Saturday afternoon in late April, under a white tent that we had borrowed from the Methodist church in Linwood. Marion Webb officiated. Gus from the hardware store walked Hannah down the aisle, because her own father had been gone since she was 19, and Gus had decided, somewhere around the time Hannah started showing up at the hardware store on Saturday mornings to buy potting supplies, that she was now under his protection. Anna, who was 19 by then and managed in front of the nursery on her own most days, was the maid of honor. The rest of the guests were the small handful of people who had become my family in the years since I had stepped off that bus in Linwood with a duffel bag and $93. Shirley from the diner, the 4 collectors I had come to trust, Hannah's thesis advisor from UT, 2 of Hannah's college friends, the part-time apprentice I had hired the previous summer, a man named Jordan who had spent his teenage years in the same group home Anna had aged out of. Brenda was not there. Brenda was not invited. I had not spoken to her in 5 years by the time we were married. I have not spoken to her since, either. Marion told me once, in passing, that she had heard through a Nashville lawyer that Brenda had remarried and moved to Florida. I did not ask for details. I do not need them. The 3rd winter after the wedding, the 8th winter I had been on the property, Hannah and I had our first child, a boy. We named him Elias, after my grandfather. He has my mother's laugh, although he does not know it yet. He will not know it until he is old enough to read the journals. I am writing this account now because it is what my grandfather did. He wrote it down. He wrote down what he was doing and why he was doing it and who he was doing it for, even when he could not be sure that the person he was doing it for would ever read what he wrote. He trusted that the work would find the reader. He trusted that the soil would remember. He was right. If you are watching this, and you are someone who was told you were a burden, or someone who was handed something in the world called worthless, or someone who was sitting in a cold place tonight, wondering whether anyone in the world ever planned for you the way other people seem to have been planned for, I want to tell you something that took me a long time to learn. The plan does not always announce itself. The plan does not always come with a letter and a key on your 18th birthday. Sometimes the plan is older than you are. Sometimes the plan was made by someone who died before you were old enough to thank them. Sometimes the plan is sitting in a wooden crate in an attic, or in a sealed envelope in a drawer, or in a back room behind a false wall, in a building that the rest of the world has decided is worthless. Sometimes the plan is just the way somebody once paid attention to you when you were too small to remember it, and the way that attention shaped you into a person who could keep going through the years when nobody was paying attention anymore. I do not know who planned for you. I do not know whether they have already shown themselves yet, or whether they're still waiting for you to walk through the door they built for you a long time ago. But I will tell you this, because I have lived it. The people who loved you do not stop loving you when they die. They leave the love behind. They put it in things. They put in objects, in buildings, in plants, in pieces of paper, in the way the light falls in a room they once spent a lot of time in. The love is still there. It is the work of the rest of your life to find it. My grandfather grew orchids for 31 years in a building everyone in the county had forgotten about. He did it because he loved his wife and his daughter and his son-in-law and his grandson. He did it because he could not save any of them from what was coming for them. But he could save me, and the way he chose to save me was to spend the last third of his life hiding a future for me in a locked room behind a false wall. I think about him every morning. I think about him when I open the gate at sunrise. I think about him when I walk into the greenhouse and the cool air hits my face and the soft hum of the cooling system tells me that the back room is still alive. I think about him when I stand in front of the rack of Eden's Vale and look at the dark green flowers with the silver edges and remember that he stabilized that line for 19 years and that he named it for my mother and that he never sold a single one of them because he was waiting for a boy who had not even been born yet when he started the work. The boy arrived. The boy is still here. The boy is a man now, with a wife and a son of his own, and a property that he is no longer afraid of losing, and a life that he no longer has to apologize for living. The greenhouse is full this morning. I can see it from the kitchen window where I am writing this. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, Check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.